The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back. The Tokin Jew. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tycho. Nice to talk to you again. It's been a week, and I, as promised, have the most interesting guests on the planet. Today is no exception. He's returning, which always honors me. Stephen Goldleaf, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Ralph. Couldn't be better.
Good. We're going to talk some ball, which is what I do best. Talking baseball is fun. Talking all sports is fun. And we're going to talk second baseman. When I was a kid, I played second base on the Kittatinny Camp varsity softball team. And it's a position that's most underrated on the field. Let's start with that. Why do you think it's an underrated position, Stephen?
Good question. I think, that basically everybody, I think it's the easiest position for people like you and me to play. I know I played second base because I didn't have much of a throwing arm. And that was really the position where a weak but accurate throwing arm could be hidden. So I played a lot of second base when I was a kid. And, I think that was one of the reasons I was able to play there.
And one of the reasons you admired the second baseman of our time, in particular, I remember talking to you about Ron Hunt, the first legitimate all-star for the Mets. And you have some thoughts on Ron Hunt, I'm sure.
Well, I do, but it's a funny thing because I think what I came up with the other day was the idea that Ron Hunt had actually created a kind of illusion for Mets fans, and this is kind of the flash that went off over my head because I'm sure that when you were first following baseball and then following the Mets, there was this legend that grew about the Mets that they had the worst third baseman in the history of the world. That they couldn't
starting with Don Zimmer. I remember.
Literally, they just had a parade of very light-hitting, bad-fielding guys who were just trying to make the club, and they would give them tryouts that would last maybe a third of the season. They would say, okay, next. And this is all it would there was just this constant parade of ball players who just were not up to the job. And this went on for over 20 years. So that the cliche was that the Mets just had terrible luck with third basemen. And even if you remember, on their championship team in 1969, I think they had the three worst third basemen who had ever played third base for a world champion in the history of baseball, which was kind of amazing that you could have a position that would be as weak as third base was, and still you could win it all. You know who I'm referring to.
Yeah, the glider was one of them. Wayne, what was Wayne's last name? The redheaded third baseman was another one.
Garrett.
Wayne Garrett. Adrian's brother, I remember, obscure third baseman with the Cubs. But they were mediocre, and I think in that 1969 team, they had a mediocre second baseman too, Boswell, but he was kind of clutch.
But I don't think it was perceived as quite the utter failure that the three third basemen were. The third one, by the way, was a rookie. Garrett was a rookie, but this guy was named Bobby File. And
yes.
One distinction that you may not be aware of. Bobby File was on the team the whole year long, and Gil Hodges decided that he didn't really need three third basemen for a short series. So he put an extra pitcher on the staff and dropped File from the World Series roster. But because the kid was a member of the team the whole year long, he let him wear his uniform and sit in the dugout, even though he wasn't eligible to play in the 1969 World Series. So that's why I say that there were actually 26 Mets who were in uniform for the 1969 World Series, which is important in terms of my end-of-life instructions.
Which are?
So my instructions are, I've told my family that if it ever is the case that I can't recite all 26 members of the Mets 1969 World Series roster, they're to unplug me from any machines, even including my life. At that point,
that's a good standard, because anybody who grew up a Met fan from the start, who doesn't have an incredible place in their heart for that 69 team, is just oblivious to the picture, the big overall picture. And, that's a good way of judging, because, Don Clendenin, Cranepool, if you want to go around the horn, you had Buddy Harrelson, which was terrific. Grody catching, Duffy Dyer backing him up. And I think we talked about this once before as I go from topic to topic. Duffy Dyer was an absolutely terrific backup. And they didn't lose very much. Jerry Grody had a great arm, but they didn't lose very much when they put Duffy Dyer in.
No, he was a great defensive catcher, and that's kind of what they excelled at. Anyway, to get back to the second base problem, though, what I'm really getting at is that Ron Hunt gave the illusion, because he had such a great rookie year, and the next year he made the All-Star team, gave the impression, okay, the Mets, they've got second base covered, that they're doing pretty well, and then they proceeded to get a couple of other ball players who weren't absolutely terrible over the years. I think Boswell, for example, was not a great player, but he managed to hit a little bit above the league average, which was an accomplishment for the Mets for his first 2 or 3 years. After that, he kind of dropped off. He didn't have much power. He didn't have much on-base percentage. And wasn't a really good fielder. But he given the initial illusion that he was a young guy who was going to hit better and already was hitting above average. Well, it turns out he wasn't actually capable of improving, and he wasn't all that great. But like I said, they seemed to have second base covered, while third base was an utter disaster. So here's the legend that got spun, that third base was an absolute horror, and second base was covered by an occasionally good player. But after I thought about it for a while, I realized, well, the Mets actually, if you tried to rank each position, third base at this point comes out really well, because in terms of two considerations, how long did the guy play at a position, and how well did the guy play at the position while he was on the team, I think third base is their number one position, because David Wright obviously filled that more than adequately. And in the years preceding Wright, they had some pretty good third basemen. They had Robin Ventura for a while. They had Hojo.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me, you know what? Third base isn't actually the Mets' weak spot historically. I thought, okay, what is their weak spot? And then it hit me that the Mets had never had a second baseman who had both qualities covered, had both a long career and a successful career. And I looked up the numbers, and this is, I guess, the nut of what I was trying to bring out today, that, in fact, second base is the position that, of all the positions on the field, that the Mets leader has played the fewest games at. And none of the players, none of the men who've played second base for the Mets have ever played more than 4 consecutive years at the position. And that's kind of amazing if you think about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even Edgardo Alfonso, who I think was the most underrated Mets second baseman, I wonder if he played 4 years. Probably not. You've done the research.
I agree with you entirely that Alfonso was easily the Mets' top quality second baseman. But if you remember, they kept switching him back and forth between second base and third base. So for several years, I think he played third base when he came up. Then they switched him to second base when they got Robin Ventura. Then when Robin Ventura left after maybe, 3 or 4 years, they switched Alfonso back to second base. And then Alfonso's his Met career was cut short because they traded him to the Giants. And actually, they didn't trade him. He signed as a free agent with the Giants, and he went completely downhill. He really didn't have a career after he joined the Giants at around the age of 30, played for 3 or 4 more years, but really wasn't very good for those 3 or 4 more years, as you probably know from having watched him closely in his San Francisco period.
Brings to mind Dougie Flynn. I think Dougie Flynn was the best defensive second baseman the Mets ever had, or at least tied. He was not only versatile, where he can play shortstop too. Just so happens he came to the Mets in that horrible trade with Seaver. But they got a lot of talent in that trade, a lot of underrated talent. Zachary was pretty good. Dan Norman was coming along. Steve Henderson just would never have been enough to compensate for the loss of Seaver. I think that broke the hearts of more Met fans than anything in any other era.
Down to one of the essential problems with second basemen in general, which is that it's not really thought of as a position where you need to have a good bat. A lot of times, second basemen are considered adequate if they're good at fielding, or like Flynn, if they're great at fielding, and they'll get to keep their jobs for a long time without having a lot of offensive pop. So that was how I think Doug Flynn and Felix Millan, for example, managed to hold on to the position for a few years. But, it just isn't really a sustainable formula to have somebody in your lineup with as weak a bat as those 2 guys had.
Well, they did the intangibles, too. The second baseman of that era, as opposed to the new age baseball where it's just about strikeouts and home runs, they can get the ball over, get the guy from not the ball over, get the man over, bunt successfully, hit and run, keep it going. It's a totally different game today. And Millan...
Ralph, I don't think it's the power. I mean, that is a large part of it, but it seems to me that the one thing that was overlooked entirely, certainly during Mian's career, and I think also a little bit during Doug Flynn's career, because these guys often, Flynn was a much weaker bat, but even he batted towards the top of the lineup, and he had the job of bunting the guy over. They would bat Mian in the number 2 spot almost every game, and he for getting the leadoff batter over. But when you look at the figures at the end of the year, he would have an on-base percentage that would be in the very low 300s, and Flynn would be lucky to get there. So they were putting these guys up and giving them an awful lot of at-bats. And, I think the way the game is played today, it's really not about moving the guy over anymore. It's all about getting on base yourself and driving in runs.
Right. What do you miss most about the game of yesterday, and what do you think is good about today's game that goes unsung?
Well, I would say the thing that most regretful about is the proliferation of pitchers, meaning that pitchers are really not expected to go anything like a complete game, and the expectation is that they'll maybe get you to the 5th or 6th inning, and then you'll just see a virtual parade of relief pitchers, often 2 or 3 in an inning, and that tends to not only make the game longer, but it also fills it with a lot of interruptions where your concentration just gets broken, and it makes the watching of the game pretty tedious. And I actually, the one thing that I really haven't had demonstrated to me over all these years of paying close attention to sabermetrics is nobody's ever really demonstrated that there is any greater incidence of injury of pitchers who pitch only 5 or 6 innings per start. The thing that I remember from the 1960s was the number of complete games that pitchers would have, and the expectations they would go 9 innings, and some pitchers would definitely be injured in the course of their careers, but it doesn't seem to me that there was any greater incidence of pitchers being injured in those years. So the question that comes up is, well, why can't these guys go 8 or 9 innings? And I don't think there's a really good answer to that.
That's the question that really plagues baseball. When I was a kid, and when you were a kid, guys like Warren Spahn would preach that you had to throw a lot of innings to keep your arm strong. And I wonder if pitchers aren't being coddled along the way in the minor leagues and what have you, just to go 5 innings, if that's what they're talking about. That middle inning relief has, and there's a case to be made because you're bringing in a stronger, less fatigued arm, and where they expect that said pitcher to throw as hard as he can for as long as he can, but not to have to pace themselves. I wonder. Plus, you have the DH in today's era, and I'm assuming that the National League will adopt the DH out of these meetings. That will be one of the focal points of the players and management getting together on a new agreement. So it has become a game of offense, not offense, but moment to moment getting power into it, looking for power as opposed to looking to get guys over and what have you.
Well, Ralph, I think what you're also describing here is something that's changed entirely outside of baseball, which is that the perspective that pitchers have to go out and pitch even if their arms are hurting, even if their arms are sore, even if they're coming off an injury. In other words, all of the macho mentality that went along with the 8 or 9 inning games, that, and this is not in baseball alone, but it seems to me that in society that we've changed. We're essentially encouraging all workers. If you're sick, don't come into work. If you have an injury, tell management about it, and they'll work with you. But the old mentality was, I'm not going to tell the manager that my arm is hurting me. He might, drop me from the rotation. I might lose my job. So the fact, say, for example, that pitchers now have multi-year contracts means that they're free to go to the management and say, listen, my arm is hurting me. I think I should be put on the DL for a couple of weeks, or I think, I can't start a game right now, and you'll have to get somebody else to help me out. And that whole mentality, I think, is really changed over the last 50 years in society more generally, where, the idea that employers have to at least pretend to show some compassion for their employees. That, I think, is a large part of the change in how pitchers are handled in Major League Baseball.
Yeah. And capitalize that pretend to show. Capitalize pretend because it's not just baseball, but the rift between labor and management is at an all-time high and in the world. Management wanting to get more out of labor and labor wanting to exchange time for an adequate exchange. And it doesn't just have to be money anymore in society.
Well, the counter-argument here, though, because what I'm hearing from Bill James in particular, he mentioned that he was a Red Sox employee for, I don't know, maybe almost 20 years. And he thought that when a team was, shall we say, unkind to its players, if it, told them to play with an injury, if it didn't give him the full story that they'd gotten from the team doctor, and told him he was less hurt than he actually was, just anything like that, that would essentially that would get around the league. The players would spread the word. Well, this team, they lied to me, and they made me, go out there and pitch and hurt myself. And this reputation would be ruinous, that team would find it very difficult to get free agents to sign with them, that their entire relationship to the ball players on their team, to ball players potentially being on their team, would be severely damaged. And that made a little sense to me, because now it seems to me that they do need to be open and direct with the injured players, simply because if the team is perceived as not caring and not looking out for their well-being, then that team is just going to find itself in trouble. And it's not really a matter of self-interest at that point.
Right, and it's so hard to tell. When you look at you say a team, say the Yankees fell under the category with Roger Maris of exactly what you're talking about. He had an injury. They didn't tell him how severe it was, and it basically curtailed his career. Okay? But when it comes for the next free agent to sign, maybe the front office is turned over. And they, as an example. So the player can't judge whether or not the management will be good to him because it's a whole different management.
Well, maybe. But on the other hand, if the team ownership, which probably doesn't have nearly the turnover that upper management does, if the team ownership was willing to support the general managers deceiving ball players or things like that, then the entire organization is not going to be that well thought of. People will say, well, they're okay with hiring, liars or whatever fault is found with the upper management. The other thing I wanted to say about injury, though, it gets back to our original topic, which is that it's also the case that for some reason second basemen seem to be much more prone to injury than other positions. That you think about it, it's pretty easy to think of shortstops who have long careers at shortstop, and shortstop isn't really very different in almost any way from second base. You could say it's even a harder position because you need a slightly better arm to play shortstop. But for some reason, a lot of second basemen either get injured early, which happened on many of these players that we were talking about on the Mets. We mentioned Alfonso, but you also had their very first second baseman, Charlie Neal, had a very hot start, and I don't think a lot of young fans realize that he was an all-star with the Dodgers. He was an MVP candidate, I believe, in the late 50s, and he was still a very young man. But when he got to the Mets, he was 30, and he was already washed up. And you'll see this in player after player. You could argue that that's what happened with Ken Boswell. You could argue that's what happened with Ron Hunt. And it's all, and I think the two most egregious cases, which really drives this point home, is the two second basemen who the Mets acquired from the Cleveland Indians, who almost from the moment they showed up at
Alomar
were unable to play. Yeah, Alomar and who else?
Oh boy, Latin guy with the B.
Yeah,
with the starting with B. Baerga. Yes. I think a lot of why second basemen are hurt is the pivot. They start out with their back to the runner coming in, as opposed to the shortstop who sees the play in front of him. And by the time the pivot takes place, this has changed since Utley, but Utley with the Mets came in. Who was it? Flores, I think. And I think that's a big part of it. And I think the reason I think that way is because when I was a kid, I was a New York Giant fan, and Davey Williams was a slick fielding second baseman and was eaten up by Carl Furillo on a pivot. And I wouldn't be surprised, hard to trace back, and sometimes the injury that the most severe injury isn't the one that takes a guy out of the game. So it could be a compilation of injuries, and I would venture to say there's no way to ever determine, but I think that pivot and the idea that the runner is coming in without used to be coming in, could do anything. could just barrel you over. I think that's one of the reasons why second basemen are injured. That's just. I
think that's exactly it. The pivot on that play means that he has to make most of the play with the runner coming in with his back to first base. And I think that, either destroys players' careers and just makes them, too injured to be able to perform.
And sometimes it's how the shortstop sets the second baseman up. Shortstop could, his throw, an accurate throw to the second baseman can make all the difference. And the shortstop's arm, can the shortstop get it over there? Quickness in releasing the ball. And here's another thing. Why is it that it used to be when we were kids, take a double play combination, they'd give a double play combination a couple of years to get better and adjust to one another. And now it doesn't seem to matter who's playing second, who's playing short. Teams make no pretense of teamwork. Lindor and McNeil, as an example. I think you have to have a certain teammate type philosophy that you don't see anymore, where players care about their fellow player. And that seems a little extreme, but it's a different game. Nellie Fox and Louis Aparicio played together for like 11 years. You don't see Bobby Richardson, Tony Kubek, Russell and the second baseman. I can't think of his name right now. He was terrific. Pardon?
Davey Lopes.
Davey Lopes. They played together a long time. You don't see that very much. And whether that increases the odds of an injury, hard to say, but it certainly decreases the skills that we're seeing on the field as fans.
Yeah, I read a good wisecrack about that infield this morning. Somebody on Facebook, I think, wrote that the Dodger infield of Garvey, Lopes, Russell, and Say were together for 8.5 years until Say got romantically involved with Yoko Ono.
I think I may have posted that with a picture of all four of them, but I copied it from someone else. That wasn't my line. It was a great line. The only thing that broke them up was Yoko Ono, and I wrote her screeching probably did it.
Here's the whole other issue. The other thing that happens with second basemen is not only that they get hurt, but often they, sometimes wisely, decide, you know what, this really isn't for me. I'm thinking of two Hall of Famers or would-be Hall of Famers who played second base for the first, 5 or 7 years of their career. Rod Carew and Pete Rose, who switched off second base to different positions because there would just not be that much pronating and turning and twisting and subjecting themselves to getting, blindside hits.
Right. Hey, I have some trivia about second base in the New York Mets. Remember Frank Tavares was their shortstop when Dougie Flynn was their second baseman. And they came in, the Mets did, to play the Giants. And I took the liberty, I knew where they stayed, where the Mets were going to stay. And I was ballsy as a kid. I'd just call anybody. I called Joe Torre when he was managing the Mets, came in to play the Giants, and I said, would it work best if Flynn was the shortstop instead of Tavares? Tavares was kind of a stiff. And the next day, he said, well, I have to think about that. That's interesting. The next day, Flynn played shortstop. I don't remember if Tavares played second or they came up with another second baseman, but all my life I will remember that I had a hand in that starting lineup the next day for the Mets. And what a cool guy Joe Torre was to just consider it, consider the option.
I remember those days. Their problem was they didn't really have a second baseman to replace Flynn, right?
Right. It didn't last very long, as I recall, but I was at the game and they announced the lineup, and I went, holy shit. Is that trippy or what?
Flynn
anyway.
Shortstop, and Tavares could. The one thing he could do was steal bases when he got on base, but unfortunately he never got on base. So you'd be waiting a long time for him to show what he could do.
Yeah, those were I call those days the Bruce Beauclair days, when they were recovering from losing Kingman, like I said, Seaver and what have you. The franchise was destroyed, but they remained interesting. Del Unser, I remember, came in to play center field for a while in those days, and it goes back to you love your team no matter what, and one sees it through during the bad times. And the memories that you have as a fan the good memories aren't always of winning times. They're the Joe Youngbloods hustling, for instance. You appreciate the players that put out more than just the superstars that are doing it with talent and with skills and no refinement of the skills. I appreciate the player who plays to his capabilities, whatever they are, and exceeds his capabilities. The overachievers I admire.
Ralph, there's a really good book that came out by a woman who was a San Francisco journalist named Joan Ryan. I don't know if you've read her.
I know her very well. I know of her. I've read her for years in the Chronicle.
She wrote a book called Intangibles, and that basically describes, actually a lot of it describes the giants of the Bobby Bonds, Jeff Kent, the Barry Bonds, Jeff Kent era, where the team was a very close team, and yet with these two very disruptive characters on it. And she tries to explain, using that team as her prime example, but with many other teams being described, that how team chemistry works. And I didn't find it entirely convincing because I would argue that it's very hard to find a team that has great chemistry but loses 100 games. And it's very hard to find a team that wins the pennant but just has terrible chemistry. That, in other words, these things go along with winning ball games, that you're going to have better team chemistry if you're a better ball club. But she makes a very interesting case for the scientific and psychological bases for teams having this mysterious element that you're describing, of players caring for each other, of players communicating, of players looking out for each other.
Absolutely. You're a sabermetric guy. how can, I'm just asking you off the top of my head, how can those statistics really be reliable when a player changes, his demeanor changes, his health changes day to day? The overall stats that you're basing it on, they base the shift on, it just it's good for a year, a year's time maybe, but day to day you still need a manager who can determine which player plays despite the statistics, who could look at a player in the clubhouse, say, how you feeling today? And look them in the eye and this, that, and the other thing. I think baseball we're missing in baseball that communication from the manager to the player to determine when to bunt, when to hit and run, when to pinch it for the guy. Casey Stengel called it hunches.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the word that I was about to use. And I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to come up with somebody who is able to manage by hunches that contradict, what I would call sabermetric wisdom. In other words, that Stengel didn't only do this by hunches, and a lot of what he did was very canny baseball, way ahead of its time. Just his reliance, for example, on platooning was way in advance of what other managers were doing in the 50s. That other teams would just decide, no, I'm going to put my best players out there, and they're going to go out and, do what they do. And Stengel would be, he would be very canny in using what he would call his hunches, but there was usually some basis for these hunches. In other words, he would, by platooning, for example, he would make sure that he got a small edge, that this guy can hit this guy, but, I'm going to sit him down against this guy. And I'm not sure how, the best hunches that I can come up with, there's stories about managers putting a lineup into a hat and pulling the batting order out of the hat. And, I actually I ran a tracer on this, that there were these examples. There was one case where Billy Martin did it when he was managing the Yankees. And it turned out that was one very smart hat, that had Willie Randolph batting second and had Greg Nettles batting sixth and batting cleanup. In other words, it wasn't that bad a lineup. And, I sort of question whether Martin, in fact, did use a hat, because if he did, like I said, that was a very smart hat.
Yeah. I remember the Giants, I don't know if it was Herman Franks or Charlie Fox, but they led Willie off for a while. And it was the idea, let's get him the most at-bats possible in the game. Notwithstanding the situation, the leadoff man is this and that. The leadoff man in your lineup is only the leadoff man once a game. Sometimes it comes up randomly where they're the leadoff man, but there was that theory that it's best to get your best players the most at bat.
Well, in fact, that's what sabermetric managers are doing now, right? Because you'll generally see at this point, and again, to go back to what we were saying before about Felix Mian and Doug Flynn being wasted for 700 at bats in the number 2 spot. Now you're seeing, generally speaking, the best hitter in the lineup is batting number 2. behind the best on-base guy because, instead of deciding, well, we have to bunt this guy over to second base, they just say, no, we're going to hit a two-run homer and, put this game out of sight. So that, I would say, I don't know if anybody's ever studied this formally, Ralph, but that if somebody wanted to, I would bet a lot of money that the average number 2 hitter in the lineup has a much higher OPS plus than the number 2 hitter in any 1950s lineup ever.
Okay. Off the subject a little bit, you're a Met fan, you're a sabermetric guy. How do you judge the hiring of Buck Showalter?
Well, there you're getting into an emotional issue. I'm completely irrational in this subject.
Baseball?
No, on the hiring of...
Okay. I'm kidding. I know you're not irrational about the subject of baseball. But
what
okay.
was simply to say that the Mets should never, ever, under any circumstances, hire a former Yankee to be their manager. And that even applies to past managers, that hiring Yogi Berra and hiring, I don't know if Dallas Green managed them before or after, but at one point, because the one terrible experience that I had that actually drove me from being a Mets fan was the mismanagement of Willie Randolph. And you know what? I don't think we should ever hire another Yankee to be the manager. So I was very much opposed. And all my friends and all my fellow Met fans are telling me that they like the choice, that Showalter's a very sensible, wise baseball man. But I'm just not buying it. And if he takes them to the World Series, I'll eat my words. But I'm not a fan of this particular hiring.
You mentioned Willie Randolph. I wonder why he never got another shot.
Well, I mean, I've got my theories, but they're not very kind to Willie Randolph. That he was so angry. He was just impossible to deal with. I don't think you were living in New York. In fact, I'm pretty sure you weren't when he was in the Mets. But I would read his or see his press conferences and then read the stories the next day, where a reporter would ask him a pretty sensible question, why did you hit for so-and-so in the 8th inning? And instead of answering the question, Randolph would just, glare at the reporter and say, well, if you knew anything about baseball, you'd know why I did that. And the reporters would say, yeah, okay, Willie, I don't know as much as you do, but could you maybe explain your reasoning? And he'd say, why should I explain my reasoning to you? And the guy would go, well, because I'm trying to write a story, and
yeah, and we give you free press coverage that really increases attendance and this, that, and the other thing. That's interesting. I did not know that about Willie Randolph. And if you're going to manage in New York, you better get along with the press because they can kill you.
A chip in his shoulder generally. I know that one of his issues was that he had actually turned down a job. The Cincinnati Reds had offered him a managerial job before he came to the Mets, and he turned it down because he said they didn't offer him enough money. And he then accused the Cincinnati Reds of being a racist organization. They said that they offered him less money because he was a black guy. And I'm looking at this and going, wait a second, you're a guy who never managed in the major leagues before, and you're probably being offered very close to the same money that any rookie manager gets offered. They offered him like a 1-year deal, and he said, no, I have to have a 3-year deal. And I'm looking at what first-time managers are offered, and generally speaking, they don't get long-term deals until they can demonstrate that they've got some managerial skills. So he was very angry to begin with. And then when the Mets, offered him a longer-term deal, he snapped it up. But he said they weren't, fair to him either, that he thought that, his race figured into this. And I'm saying, no, I think you got bigger problems than that, Willie.
Yeah, that's the small. If you don't have the rapport with the press, and it just makes for a negative situation. They'll eat you up. But hey, we're up against the time. This is always fun for me, Stephen. Please keep coming back.
Glad to. Anytime, and anytime I have one of these other, nutty ideas, I'll let you know about it. We can.
That's what I love. You made my day the other day. Let's talk about second baseman. I knew you'd have something that you're thinking about. Not just I call you and go, let's talk, but a solid, concrete topic is always nice. Please stay healthy. Please stay healthy in retirement. Next time I'll ask you a little more about how you're adjusting to retirement. And is it easy? That'll be the closing question today. Is it easier than you thought to be retired or more difficult to be retired?
Well, for me, it's a lot easier, but I'm also dealing with retiring during a pandemic, which is a very strange situation because all my retirement plans were to do a lot of the traveling that I couldn't do when I had a job. And now I'm less traveling than I was doing when I had a job because I don't want to get on an airplane or any vehicle with strangers until this pandemic goes away, and that may not be for a while.
It may not, and it may not be in our lifetime. We may have to adjust to a different world, and it's what's depressing. It could have been caught in the nip. If people would just get vaccinated and boosted, this wouldn't be an issue in 6 months, and that's what's frustrating. But a lot of things frustrate you. Frustrate one.
I'm sorry.
Go.
But it's actually been good in one sense, though, because I've been able to get a lot of writing done. And, being stuck in the house for months at a time means that I don't have anything to do but write. So it's been a very productive period for me. And I really, I think that my retirement certainly was a timely choice.
Beautiful. Again, keep coming back, my friend, and more importantly, stay healthy.
You as well, Ralph. I'll be speaking to you in the future soon, I'm sure.
Makes me glow that you will. Talk soon. Thank you for listening, everybody. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tycho, and my guest was Stephen Goldleaf. Thank you again, Stephen. Adios, everybody, and happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.